Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Legends of the Jedi. Before we begin today's episode, I want to thank everyone who took the time to listen to the first episode. I received a lot of positive feedback, and, much like Darth Nihilus feeds on Force-sensitive individuals to sustain his power, your compliments and criticisms are the fuel that keeps this program going. And if you don't know who Darth Nihilus is, well, don't you worry, because we're going to get to him when we cover Knights of the Old Republic 2. Just a minor housekeeping item before we dive right into it. A few people were asking me how often I plan to put out these episodes. Right now, if everything goes according to plan, I'm going to try and release an episode once a week. But even if everything doesn't go according to plan, I'm still hoping to release an episode at least once every 2 weeks, so please keep checking back in for further content. Last time, we talked about the Second Great Schism and how the 12 Dark Jedi heretics were exiled to wild space. We also introduced a cast of characters, like the Jedi Odan-Ur, Empress Tita, and the hyperspace explorers Gavin, Jory, Darrigan. When we last saw them, Gavin and Jory were fleeing the planet Sinagar in the Starbreaker 12 after running afoul of a local merchant. Punching random numbers into their Navicomputer, they vanish into the unknown. And so this brings us right into issue 2 of the Golden Age arc, entitled Funeral for a Dark Lord. The issue opens with a sprawling picture of an ancient valley, littered with imposing edifices, giant statues, and ornate monoliths. If you need a visual representation, think Valley of the Pharaohs in ancient Egypt, but on an even grander scale. And if you don't know what that means, then Google Valley of the Pharaohs in ancient Egypt and you'll see what I mean. In fact, probably do one better and just Google Valley of the Dark Lords and you'll see what I mean. We learn that this valley is on the planet Korriban, a planet on the far side of the galaxy, unmarked on any map found in the Old Republic. This sheltered desert canyon of tombs is where the Dark Lords of the Sith come to bury their dead. And on this day, a new tomb has been opened for another occupant to be laid to rest in this Valley of the Dark Lords. Now, many of you may actually remember the Valley of the Dark Lords from the original Knights of the Old Republic game. This is one of the main story areas that we get to visit in that game. That said, however, it's important to remember that our current story takes place 5,000 years before Star Wars Episode 4. Knights of the Old Republic, on the other hand, takes place 3,956 years before Episode 4, so a little over 1,000 years later. So we still have a bit of ground to cover before we get into Knights of the Old Republic, but I promise, good things come to those who wait. Right off the bat, we're introduced to a character named Ludo Kresh. He's leading the funeral procession through the Valley of the Dark Lords. We're told that Ludo follows the old ways and carefully observes the rituals of the Sith. His desire is to become the next Dark Lord of the Sith. It's also revealed that the recently deceased is a Dark Lord of the Sith named Marka Ragnos, who ruled with an iron fist for over a century. Ludo places a victory helmet on what can only be described as a sarcophagus. Again, the ancient Egypt influence here is unmistakable. On page 6 of this issue, we see a statue that looks like the ancient Egyptian god Anubis. At this point, I just want to pause for a moment and point out that there's a difference between Sith Lords, of which there are several, and the Dark Lord of the Sith, which is pretty much like the first among equals. He's the guy who rules all the other Sith Lords. And so Ludo Kresh is just simply a Sith Lord, but he hopes to become the next Dark Lord of the Sith. So the funeral of the great Dark Lord of the Sith, Marka Ragnos, has drawn quite a crowd, and Ludo turns to them, and he addresses the crowd and says something like this. "All hail the memory of Marka Ragnos. His legacy will live for centuries among the Sith people and their rulers." And he's not even wrong about this. You see, Marka Ragnos is a name that comes up again and again in the lore of this era. At this point, the comic cuts away and flashes to the Starbreaker 12. Do you remember those random coordinates that Jory punched in last issue? Well, we find out that the ship's flight path takes it farther than any recorded vessel from the Republic has ever gone. I think at this point it's fair to say that we're through the looking glass here, people. When Gav and Jory bring the ship out of hyperspace, they try to get their bearings. We find out that nothing is very well mapped in this section of the galaxy. Luckily, their return course is locked into the Navicomputer, so they don't have to worry about getting back to Sinagar. But why would they want to go back there? They're kind of fugitives now. Jory wonders out loud whether or not this new route will be worth anything to the Navigators Guild. Perhaps this is the route that will solve all their monetary issues. After that brief interlude, the narrative brings us back to Korriban, where we find out that another person of interest has arrived late to the funeral. At this point, we're introduced to a very important person of interest, the Sith Lord Naga Sadow. He's the arch-rival of Ludo Kresh. Both Kresh and Sadow are depicted as pure-blooded Sith. And so if you remember from last time, that basically means that they have red skin and bony protrusions. And to further assist with the visualization, both of them are dressed in very ornate armor. For instance, when we first meet Sadow, he has a greatsword at his hip, he's wearing a cape, He has shoulder mantles with spikes on them, kind of like Shredder from the Ninja Turtles, and he's wearing a cylindrical headpiece. Sato is also sporting a very distinctive beard, in that it only really comes out from his chin. There's no other facial hair on him. In fact, other than his eyebrows, this is the only hair on his head. If you Google Nagasato, then you're going to find some very interesting artistic renditions of what he looks like. Now that you have that interesting visual in your head, we can return back to the story. Ludo Kresh is furious. He proclaims that they wait for no man, lord or slave, and continues on with the funeral. At this point, we learn the awful truth of the funeral rites. A group of slaves, chosen as a final sacrifice, will be interred in the crypt with Marka Ragnos. The only difference is that whereas Ragnos is dead, they'll be interred alive. Now, without getting too much into ancient Egyptian funeral rites, the parallels here are unmistakable. In ancient Egypt, pharaohs of the First Dynasty were often buried with their servants, as it was believed their servants would continue to serve them in the afterlife. And I think probably something similar is going on here. At the very least, I think the narrators are trying to evoke a sense of dread that one might feel even at the thought of getting interred alive. Returning to the galaxy far, far away, the crypt slams shut, the dust settles, and the slaves, who are very much still alive, are sealed forever with the dead. It's a grim fate. Before we move on here, an interesting thing to note is that the slaves all appear to be pure-blooded Sith as well. This is not a situation where one alien species is oppressing another, so we can conclude from this that the Sith are not above enslaving their own. After the body is interred, Nagasato confronts Ludo Kresh in front of the mausoleum. He tells Ludo that he's come to take his place at the funeral of Marka Ragnos, while Kresh doesn't mince any words in return. He tells Sato that Sato doesn't belong there, and that his rebellious actions and experiments are a threat to the entire civilization. And Kresh doesn't stop there, he's out for blood. He doubles down, jabbing a finger at his rival, and he says the following. I command here. You would destroy the greatness Marka Ragnos maintained in the Sith Empire when he was Dark Lord. You shame his memory. But Sato isn't going to be deterred by this fanfare. He basically comes out and says that by rights, he should be the new Dark Lord of the Sith. Kresh, ever the traditionalist, bites back at Sato and tells them that his progressive ways will ruin the Sith Empire. Now we learn here that Sato is stepping in dangerous waters and unleashing powers he does not understand. Or at least that's the way Kresh sees it. This refers back to the quote-unquote experiments he was accused of conducting earlier. I just want to take a second to point out here the irony of this statement. So, Kresh, who follows the old ways, is condemning Sato for basically doing what got the 12 Dark Jedi heretics exiled in the first place. As I mentioned last time, these heretics found their way to Korriban and established themselves as the original Dark Lords. It seems a bit odd here that Kresh is now giving Sato a hard time for basically doing the same thing. When it comes down to it, some people hate change, but Sato is not one of them. He accuses the Sith Empire of becoming stagnant. He says something like this. For centuries we have done nothing but wallow in our riches and relive our ancient conquests of these worlds. That is no longer enough. Our ancestors, my ancestors, were great Jedi banished for their beliefs. I will not let that flame be extinguished by our complacency. While this rap battle is ensuing below, we flash back to Gav and Jory, who have decided to explore the planet. They need to be able to convince the Navigators Guild to open a trade route here, or else their information is worthless. And although I didn't mention it directly earlier, I think it goes without saying that the planet that they found is Korriban. Back at the funeral, things have escalated. Sato finishes his tirade by calling Kresh a backwards thinker. In response, Kresh pulls out a greatsword and literally says, "There can only be one." Okay, so now we're talking. Sato takes out his own greatsword and jams it into the ground. He calls on the power of the Sith, his Jedi blood, and the dark side to supercharge his sword. Purple lightning energy crackles around it. Who even needs a lightsaber when you have a giant sword coursing with purple electricity? Kresh calls on the same energy and holds up his sword He-Man style. He's all like, "I fight for the Sith Empire, Nagasato. You fight for yourself." And Sato in return is like, "No, I fight for the future." And with that, they both attack each other. You know, I kind of get the impression that this thing happens probably very frequently at Sith funerals. The crowd looks on at the battle with what can only be described as grim resignation. The fighting itself is savage. Both fighters swing at each other with reckless abandon. Sato draws first blood when he uses the Force to throw some bricks at Kresh's head. At this point, there's no mistaking it. This is a fight to the death. Before the outcome can be determined either way, the Force Ghost of Marka Ragnos appears before them. Not even the chains of the grave can hold the Dark Lord of the Sith. With a wave of his hand, Ragnos tells the Sith Lords to witness the past. We see images from thousands of years ago splashed across the pages. This is the story that they tell. Once, long ago, there were mighty Jedi of the Republic, brothers in the Force. But the great schism turned Jedi against Jedi. Their ancestors were driven off and cast out. Here, on the far side of the galaxy, they turned their exile into victory. They found the Sith people on these unblemished worlds who treated them like gods. After many centuries, some of them even interbred with the Sith, but we learn that others still bear the true Jedi blood. Ragnos tells Kresh and Sado that this is their golden age. Then, with some blunt foreshadowing, he warns them that those times may be at an end. The fate of the Sith Empire hangs in the balance. The narrative jumps across the galaxy back to the Koros system, where we find our Jedi friend Odan who just woke up in a cold sweat. He has foreseen some very troubling images, and decides to go tell Empress Teta and her Jedi advisor Mem Adil. As Odan strides into Teta's throne room, she is being addressed by none other than Arba the Hutt. He's complaining to her that Gavin Jory repaid his kindness with treachery by stealing a ship and damaging his repair dock. In a hilarious scene, he asks Empress Teta to bring them to justice, and then begs her not to tell anyone that he extended credit. Teta assures him that his secret is safe with her, and that if those young criminals Gavin Jory ever return to Sinagar, they will be apprehended at once. At this point, Odan cuts in and tells the Empress about his nightmare premonition. He believes that the banished evil Jedi are still out there and that they're going to attack the Republic. Mem Adil backs Odan up. He tells the Empress that the Force does not lie. Now, in what has become shocking in our own day and age, Empress Teta actually listens to her advisors. There's a reason I called her wise last episode, and this is it. She says, look, we're going to prepare for this. Our 7 worlds have gained some prominence in the Republic, and I'm going to the galactic capital Coruscant in a few days. And when I get there, I'll raise this matter with the powers that be. The name Coruscant should be familiar to many of you. It's the galactic capital, it's the seat of the Old Republic. It was featured very heavily in the prequels, it's where the Jedi Temple's based. And there's that guy in Phantom Menace who's even like, Coruscant, the entire planet is one big city. So that's where she intends to go. Now, flashback to Korriban, we have Ludo Kresh extending an olive branch to Sado. He says, hey, look, Marco Ragnos is right. Let's make peace for the good of the Empire. But Sado's having none of it and brushes it aside. He says it's going to take more than the words of a ghost to make him forget his sworn enemy. Before things can descend into even further chaos, the two are interrupted. You see Gavin Jory finally land on Korriban. And Jory is pretty thrilled with this find. She calls this a spectacle, monuments covered in gold and jewels as far as the eye can see. You can practically see dollar signs light up in her eyes. Stepping out of the ship, Gavin announces that they come from the Republic and that they come in peace. Jory follows him, explaining that they want to set up a trading relationship with the civilization. And I just want to spend a moment talking about the art on this page, because it's pretty hilarious. Both Gav and Jory are standing outside their ship. Gav's holding a scepter and Jory's holding some kind of book. They both look very wide-eyed and hopeful. And then, in less time than it takes Han Solo to make the Kessel Run, the siblings are surrounded by these hulking Sith warriors, and all of them are carrying very pointy swords and very pointy spears. The issue ends much like it begins, with a debate. Kresh thinks Gav and Jory are precursors to an invasion, and he wants to kill them outright. Sado, on the other hand, says no, we should absolutely interrogate them. This may be the key to ripe new fields for us to conquer. Now, before I get into issue 3, I want to shine the spotlight on Korriban. One could argue that at its core, it's a ripoff of ancient Egypt, but I really think it's much more than that. You see, the creators were tasked with portraying an ancient society 5,000 years before the events of Star Wars. Deriving inspiration from ancient Egypt is actually pretty clever. It's something that many of us can understand and relate to. And yet, even though the parallels are blatant, they managed to put a Star Wars spin on it. And this issue is unmistakably Star Wars. We have, Force powers on full display, forbidding visions and premonitions, mysterious discoveries, Force ghosts, an evil empire, a sword fight, and last but not least, Arba the Hutt. The brilliance of this series is that even though the story takes place in the distant past, and there's no mistaking that, believe me, it still retains all of that Star Wars goodness. And like it or not, Korriban is here to stay. They even brought it into the Disney continuity. George Lucas renamed the planet Moraband for the Clone Wars, but Wikipedia tells me that Moraband is just one of the names of the planet. Kind of like how you might call our planet Earth or Terra, depending on what language you speak. So that means that it's still valid to call this planet Korriban, even in the new expanded universe. Very cool. If any of you are at all interested in seeing it on the screen, Korriban is featured in Season 6 of the Clone Wars. I believe it's in an episode called Sacrifice, and it's pretty standalone, so I encourage you to check it out. If you're interested in what that episode's about, not to spoil it too much, but Yoda travels to that planet to learn the secrets of eternal consciousness. But hopefully in the years to come, we'll see more stories set on that planet, because it's a Star Wars mainstay. Okay, with all that said, we can jump right into issue 3, The Fabric of an Empire. The opening scrawl tells us that after Gav and Jory stumbled right into the heart of the fabled Sith Empire, they are set to become pawns in a power struggle between the Sith and the Republic. The issue opens with a massive fortress built on the edge of a large cliff. The fortress is on the planet Ziost, we learn, and this is the central world of the Sith Lords. It's neutral ground where the descendants of the exiled Jedi can conduct the business of Empire. We also learn that the Dark Lord of the Sith rules the Empire from Ziost, but as we know from last issue, that seat is presently vacant. When we peer into one of the windows of this massive fortress, we can see about 10 Sith Lords seated around a large table. One of these Sith Lords is literally a mummified-looking head in a containment chamber. We learn that his name is Simus, and that he lost a duel against Marka Ragnos centuries before. Rather than succumbing to death, he used the powers of the dark side to keep himself alive, but barely. He's only a head. We're thrust right into the middle of a council meeting. Ludo Kresh doubles down in his belief that Gav and Jory are the precursors to an invasion. Simus tells Kresh that he speaks from mindless fear, and that this could be an opportunity for the Sith. Nagasato agrees with this. He tells the assembled lords that they could lose 100 score new worlds to dominate, the riches of 1,000 races, and control of the very galaxy itself if they don't seize this opportunity. Taking out his sword, Sato thrusts it on the table pretty dramatically. Control of the galaxy, he says, is after all the Sith destiny. With those ominous words, we flash to a scene beneath the fortress in the icy caverns of Ziost. Gav and Jory have been locked away in the dungeons. Gav is trying to cheer her up, but Jory's having none of it. She knows they've really messed up this time. Her pity party is interrupted by a couple Sith warriors holding none other than the head of Simus. He tells them that their fate has been decided and that the Council of Sith Lords intends to execute them as soon as possible. So it seems like at the end of the day they all sided with Kresh, or at least enough of them did that it carried the day. At this, Gav stands up and he's all like, "Don't we even get a trial or a last meal or something? Man, not in the Sith Empire." At the same time, we're shown Gav and Jory's ship, Starbreaker 12. It appears that it's been impounded in one of the fortress's hangar bays. One of Sato's agents, pretending to be a slave, manages to find a way onto the ship without attracting any attention. Sato himself has retreated to his private stronghold on the dark side of the moon, Karshion, a place where sunlight never touches. It's also a place that's ideal for hiding and practicing certain dark arts. But at the moment, Sato isn't conducting any forbidden rituals. He's waiting for a transmission from his agent, and eventually he gets that transmission, and his agent lets him know that blaster pistols were found on Gav and Jory's ship. Here we get to glimpse into the inner workings of Sato's mind. He intends to use Gav and Jory as scapegoats. By channeling his inner Ozymandias from the Watchmen, he wants to create the specter of an outside enemy to unify the Sith people and reignite the flame of the Sith Empire. He needs something that will distract the people from political squabbles and internal struggles, and really tie them all together. I just want to pause here for a moment to reflect on the words of Marka Ragnos when he visited them as a Force ghost in the last issue. See, Ragnos said at that time that they were actually living in a golden age, but Sato's belief, as shown here, is that the golden age has passed and that he needs to reignite the flame of the golden age, so he wants to bring it back. So you can already tell that he's not heeding Ragnos' warning. Could this lead to ruin down the road? We'll just have to find out. So, Sato walks up to one of his warriors, he clenches his fist and he says, "Summon all of my loyal Massassi. Gather weapons, prepare the ships. We must strike Ziost fast and hard." But before we go on, let's pause for a second and talk about these loyal Massassi, because that name might sound familiar to some of you. In Star Wars Episode 4 and in Rogue One, you may recall that the rebels are hiding in a bunch of temples on Yavin 4. These temples are known as the Massassi temples. So I want you to keep this connection in the back of your mind, because we'll eventually come back to it and learn why the temples are named after these Sith warriors who lived 5,000 years before that point. So returning to our story, Sato and his warriors infiltrate the great Sith fortress on Ziost and make their way to the icy prison caverns below. The warriors are under strict orders not to kill anyone they come across. You see, Sato doesn't want to get caught and he doesn't want anyone to know that he's there. These warriors use the blaster pistols from the Starbreaker 12 to cause some damage and kill the prison guards. In one panel, we have Sato holding a smoking pistol over the corpse of a guard, muttering about how it was necessary for the Empire, and how their future is now inevitable. It's kind of like Julius Caesar saying, the die is cast. Sato eventually finds his way to Gavin Jory's cell, and he throws open the cell door. He tells the Darrigan siblings that he's there to rescue them, almost in like a twisted parody of Luke Skywalker rescuing Princess Leia and the Death Star in Episode 4. He also puts it to them very bluntly. You can either come with me, or you can stay and die. Both of them jump at the chance to escape, and are taken by the Massassi to Sato's waiting ship. Sato decides to stay behind and finish his preparations, and after some time passes, he hears the voice of Simus, who is being carried by a Sith warrior.
Naga Sato, my old friend. What has happened here? Are you hurt?
In fairness, I don't actually know if that's what Simus sounds like, but he is a mummified head in a box, so I'm going to take a wild guess and say that that's probably close to the mark. Anyway, Sato turns to him and we can see the fear in Simus's eyes. He knows what's coming next. Sato points the blaster pistol at Simus and pulls the trigger. He kills both him and the warrior holding him. Then, Sato plants the gun at the crime scene and walks away. There's no turning back now. The die's been cast a second time. He's even further into it now than he was before. In the meantime, Gavin Jory are brought back to Sato's private stronghold on the dark moon of Kar-Shion. Now that they've been safely spirited away, Sato marches towards the council chamber room on Ziost, and he throws back the double doors in a very dramatic entrance. He walks into the middle of Ludo Kresh, telling the council that he was right all along, and how the two captives should have been executed immediately. Sato plays dumb, and he asks, what happened? What's going on? Kresh tells him that they've been attacked. They believe that there was a military raid from the Republic to free the prisoners Gavin Jory. Kresh then shows Sato the two blaster pistols and tells him that they were found at the scene. Sato continues to play dumb, telling him how he's never seen weapons such as these before. And look here, Sato points out, they have the same symbols on them as the symbols from the Starbreaker 12, so chances are they're from that ship. In a pretty ironic scene that follows, one of the Sith Lords holds up a sack and says something like, "They killed Simus, they're monsters." Sato takes the head of Simus and holds it up, lamenting his passing. He says something like, "He was my mentor, my teacher, the noblest among us. He always offered his wisdom. Unlike Ludo Kresh, I refuse to cower in the shadows of this threat. I refuse to tremble like a coward and wait for the enemy to come after us. We must fight back." With that rousing eulogy, Sato implores the Sith Lords to unite under his rule. And except for Kresh, the Sith Lords present are moved by his speech. If any of you have watched Game of Thrones, this one scene over here has this whole King in the North dynamic going for it, where they all begin to proclaim Naga Sato as the new Dark Lord of the Sith. You even have like Ludo Kresh in the background being like, he's going to bring ruin to the Empire, and it's just falling on deaf ears. They've already made up their minds. In a fit of rage, Kresh takes out his sword and smashes it on the ground. He refuses to take any part in this farce, and he believes this will be the destruction of the Sith Empire. The issue ends with Sato standing triumphant, surrounded by the remaining Sith Lords, all of whom have taken out their swords and are bowed before him, swearing their fealty. We learn that each Lord controls about a dozen worlds. Sato tells them to gather their men and their ships and their banners, and he makes his intention clear. They strike first at the Republic. Once the Republic is defeated, they intend to conquer the entire galaxy. A new golden age indeed. And that brings us to the end of issue 3. But before we cap off today, I want to talk a bit about Naga Sato. He's one of the more iconic villains in this era of Star Wars history, and he's every bit the Sith Lord. Cunning, a master manipulator, obsessed with power, and willing to do whatever it takes to get his way. If we were to reduce his character to a fantasy trope, Sato would be your archetypal dark sorcerer. The issues hint at his dark practices and forbidden experiments, but we haven't really seen much of it yet. Naga Sato is a name that comes up again and again in Legends material. One piece of lore that I want to call out is this book Crosscurrent by Paul S. Kemp. That name already may be familiar to some of you. Kemp is best known for writing a bunch of Dungeons & Dragons novels that take place in the Forgotten Realms campaign setting. He's also written some Star Wars books, one of which is named Crosscurrent. Now, Crosscurrent is interesting. It takes place 41 years after Episode 4, A New Hope. For context, at that point in the continuity, Luke Skywalker had already reestablished the Jedi Order. But what makes Crosscurrent interesting is that it features time travel elements. And while introducing time travel into a narrative usually makes me run for the hills, I thought it was handled pretty well here. The book features protagonist Jaden Core, a Jedi Knight who you may remember as the hero of the Jedi Knight Jedi Academy video game, and also the apprentice of Kyle Katarn. Core comes into conflict from Sith of the era that we're currently speaking of, the 5,000 years BBY era, when these Sith go through a hyperspace portal that drops them into, present day 41 after the Battle of Yavin. Sado's name is mentioned a few times in the novel because the Sith of that era would have known exactly who he was. And this is one of the things that I love about this era, is that despite the fact that we're talking about something that happened 5,000 years before Episode 4, it continues to be relevant and woven into later materials. And we're going to see that kind of thing happen again and again as we continue on with this story. So that's it for today. That's all she wrote. Please join us next time as we wrap up the Golden Age of the Sith story arc. In the words of Darth Vader,
"We would be honored if you would join us."
And remember, fellow Wayfarers, if you remember only one thing from this podcast, the Force will be with you, always.